All right, folks, I think I'm going to go ahead and kick us off because we can definitely start doing some intros to this event and intros to the two panelists that we have here as we try to get our other two in here. For some reason, their links were a little difficult, and I think we can fix it in a minute. I am Nicole Golden. I'm the executive director of Texas Gun Sense, and this is Safe Homes, Safe Communities, Guns, and Domestic Violence, which is our Lunch and Learn as part of our web series. We were very much looking forward to doing this and having this really critical conversation during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is through the month of October. And we have some really excellent speakers and experts in this field who work across the state of Texas in various capacities, who are going to just tell us about their work and provide some context and solutions around the really often deadly intersection between domestic violence and firearms. I'll tell you just a quick, brief intro to Texas Gun Sense if you're not familiar with us. We are unwavering in our commitment to end gun violence in Texas. We advance safe gun laws at the legislature, and we work to build and improve safe gun culture in Texas. And one of the most important things we do is bring in partners like these great panelists we have here today. Um, and so let me go ahead and introduce to you the folks who we do have here, and then we can start sending some questions their way. Jeremy Flowers is here. He's the Director of Coordinated Community Response with the East Texas Crisis Center. And then we have Erin Mays, who is the Public Policy Manager, Legal, at the Texas Council on Family Violence. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you for
Yeah,
having
thank you for having us.
Sure thing. I'm going to go ahead and this is sort of a roundtable question. And when we bring in Swati and Natalie, we can send this question back over to them too. But I'd like to ask you, Erin and Jeremy, um, uh, what are the key challenges in addressing domestic violence in Texas communities today? And how do firearms play a role in the risks survivors face? So, Erin, you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. We see lots of challenges in addressing domestic violence in Texas. One of the challenges that we continue to see are issues with housing, both because of a shortage of affordable housing for survivors and also a shortage in the number of shelter beds that are available across the state. Another challenge that we see time and time again is with the lack of free or affordable legal representation. Particularly for survivors who are involved in the legal system with divorce or child custody issues. For survivors who have children, these two issues, housing and being able to have legal representation, may govern if or when they're able to leave the person who's using violence against them, which puts them at an increased risk of continuing to experience violence in the future. In terms of how firearms play a role in the risk survivors face, the data is clear. The presence of a firearm where there is family violence increases the risk of homicide by up to 500%. So that's a very staggering statistic to me. Not only does it put them at a heightened risk of being murdered by their intimate partner, but it's also often used as a tool to threaten them and keep them around. So survivors may not only fear for their own lives, but for the lives of their children, family, and friends. So.
Thank you, Erin. Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Erin said. Housing is definitely a challenge, I think across the state. And, you know, uh, one of the challenges is, domestic violence isn't popular to talk about. And that brings its own challenges. Another challenge we face is having communities understand the impact that intimate partner violence has and believe in survivors when they come forward, without minimizing their experience, questioning their credibility, or asking why they stayed. Every time a survivor speaks out, they're taking a risk. And that in itself leads to another challenge, creating awareness or understanding around how much danger survivors are in when they do seek help or speak out. And I think that's one intersection where firearms come in, is because firearms, as Erin said, are used as a tool to amplify fear or exert control over survivors. And, to reiterate the statistic that Erin shared, we know that the presence of firearms increase the likelihood of homicide. Um, you know, a firearm is the most common tool used in intimate partner violence homicide. And, we found out this month, thanks to Erin and our colleagues over at the Texas Council on Family Violence, they released their Honoring Texas Victims report. And in our 5 county service area, 3 out of the 5 victims who were killed due to intimate partner violence, a firearm was used in those instances. So I think when we talk about challenges and ways to address domestic violence, I think it's about shifting culture. I think we need to shift perspectives and take survivor-centered approaches. We need to have uh, informed communities that are knowledgeable of the impact that domestic violence has. And specifically, when we talk about the culture, domestic violence, and guns, we have to, uh, in my opinion, bring in the masculine socialization, right? Because boys and men socialization about what it means to be a man is directly tied to power and control. And so firearms become a tool to exert that power. So I think we need to look at the close connection between masculine socialization and the use of firearms, because in addition to firearms being the number one weapon used in intimate partner violence, the majority of those are also perpetrated by men.
I really appreciate that context. And I'm very glad to say we have our third panelist has joined us. Hi, Natalie. We have Natalie Nanasi, who's a professor at SMU School of Law, where she's a director of the Hunter Legal Center for Victims of Crimes Against Women. And Natalie, we started off with a roundtable question that Erin and Jeremy answered, and so I'm going to ask you now. What are the key challenges in addressing domestic violence in Texas communities today? And how do firearms play a role in the risks survivors face?
Yeah, so thank you, Nicole, and apologies to everybody for the technical difficulties. I'm going to give a short answer to this question because I fear that anything I say will be repetitive of things that I was not privy to hearing before. So let me just assume I'm going to reinforce what my co-panelists said, which is, look, what we know is that when a woman is killed, the likely perpetrator is her intimate partner. And we know that the likely method of that femicide is a firearm. We also know that, and I know we'll get to this, that laws that remove firearms from the hands of domestic abusers are saving women's lives if they are enforced. And unfortunately, they are not being enforced sufficiently in Texas or really across the country, right? So that's to me the key, right? It's the data is absolutely clear, right? That this is a problem. I think I came in on the tail end of thinking about uh, masculinity and hegemonic masculinity and the trend in this country towards a very like hyper masculinity and how firearms are involved in that and how that impacts the lives of survivors of intimate partner violence. And I could not agree more. And I suppose the only thing I will say, just as an added comment, is that this is impacting not just women in their homes, but also our communities at large, right? We know that intimate partner violence is a significant predictor of mass violence, that if you start to pay attention to the reporting around the mass shootings and you dig in past the first couple of paragraphs, you'll see that typically that person will also that person's family members and intimate partners are often impacted as well. And so So it's a grave issue. And hopefully what we'll leave this webinar, I don't want to spoil it for everybody seeing, is that there are actually things that we can do because we know what the problem is, right? So it's just a matter of implementing the many solutions that my co-panelists and many other people across the state in this country have identified as being able to solve it.
I'm really glad you said that you pointed out the intersection with mass shootings and domestic violence. And we've dealt with some of that with some horrific tragedies here in Texas, that pattern. Just FYI, Swati is still trying to get in here. When she does, we'll just start giving her time to answer, but I'm going to continue on with the questions. Let me see. Erin, this is for you. Jeremy brought up TCFV's Honoring Texas Victims report, which we also rely on a lot and really appreciate that you publicize that every year. So according to this year's Honoring Texas Victims report, what does the most recent data reveal about the intersection of firearms and domestic violence? And how should it guide policy and advocacy going into the next legislative session?
Yeah, so we have an incredible team at TCFE that combs through that data each year to highlight the trends we're seeing in family violence homicides in the state of Texas. One of the reasons we continue to write this report is to honor the victims who lost their lives and remind people that there are actual people behind the numbers that we often see on paper, because I think it's really easy to forget that when you're looking through data. But these are people who had a life, a family, possibly children, et cetera, before this happened. So over the past 10 years, the number of women murdered by an intimate partner with a firearm in Texas has nearly doubled. This is disturbingly increasing trend that will continue to destroy countless Texas families and hundreds of more lives if it is left unaddressed. In 2024 specifically, roughly 70% of intimate partner homicides were related to firearms. Over 80% of perpetrators had previous law enforcement involvement, and many of those were already prohibited from possessing a firearm at the time of the homicide. This research shows that many of these homicides are preventable. Each session, TCFE has worked on a measure related to this report directly, so we always try to keep that at the forefront. We've held many measures related to firearms, and they can often be challenging, but we'll continue to work on policy to address lethality factors, not just firearms. As for advocacy, there's nothing prohibiting communities from starting to implement firearm transfer protocols to help address kind of the gap between the laws that are already on the books versus what's actually being used. And you can start small with that, such as providing storage areas for those weapons, working with law enforcement, educating law enforcement, and building on that as time goes on. Also incorporating affidavits of relinquishments into cases to show that this person who's prohibited from possessing a firearm is actually relinquishing those weapons once they become a prohibited possessor. So baby steps like that can be huge in terms of making sure that some of these homicides that we know are preventable are prevented in the future.
Erin, I have like the quickest follow-up question because you were talking about what localities can do. My understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is there's around 10 counties that have a protocol in place in some form, or that's pretty clear in Texas. Am I right about that? Like maybe you can just say very quickly, like what areas are making progress.
Yeah, so I don't have a list of all of the exact counties that we have that have programs right now, but I think it was around 10.
Mhm.
But that's out of 254. So that's, a very small percentage. So any steps that counties can take, if they don't necessarily have maybe the resources to do an overhaul and incorporate all of these different ideas, if they can take any of those baby steps, that is helpful. And another thing too that we see, some counties have domestic violence high risk teams,
Mm.
and those domestic violence high risk teams can look at these cases and see some of these lethality factors and how to address them.
Mhm.
And that's also another important step towards preventing some of these homicides, is starting to incorporate those high risk teams, which are a multidisciplinary team with law enforcement, prosecutors, whoever is going to come to the table, advocates to work on those cases. And I don't know if Jeremy wants to speak to that at all. I think we were at a conference recently together. We keep running into each other, like I said, but yeah, incorporating those domestic violence high-risk teams and the firearm transfer protocols more across the state as we continue will be super helpful in continuing to work toward preventing homicides.
I actually think that that fits great into what I was going to ask Jeremy, and hopefully Swati too when she gets here, since both of you worked directly in community response, and so we wanted you to know, Jeremy, what does true coordination across advocates, law enforcement, and the courts look like when it's working well, and what are the gaps that still need to be addressed there?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just want to parrot and amplify everything that Erin said because it's instrumental in what coordinated community response is. And just for transparency, the coordinated community response department at my agency still has its training wheels on. So I'm figuring out what that looks like when it works well. But from what I see through our domestic violence high risk team and our partnerships with our other system partners through education and court accompaniment and the judges, it's a shared understanding uh, about the issue, right? About prioritizing survivor safety, about why they're responding the way they do to certain things through trauma response, and just centering the survivor's experience every step of the way, right? And so when we do that, I see it functioning well. And just to kind of go back to what Erin was talking about earlier, we are in the very beginning stages of trying to implement firearm transfer protocol because that is mandated by some of our judges when they do protective order hearings or they're filing charges that that's something they can do. And another thing that uh, we are encouraging not only our prosecutors to advocate for, but also our judges is to um, in addition to removing firearms, is to refer them to our batterer intervention and prevention program, which is a 28-week program that just where the facilitators create space for offenders to find accountability for the behaviors that they've chose to act violently. So in some of the gaps, I think, Natalie brought it up and Erin alluded to it too, is, the enforcement, right? Or just the lack of, having something in place like a firearms transfer protocol or a domestic violence high risk team, or even just the communication between all of the system partners is something that's very much needed as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that TCFB, you all have been really involved in advocating for measures both at the state level and locally to try to get some kind of oversight. And those are things that we very much have tried to support in our capacity as well, and would like to keep looking toward that kind of accountability at all levels of government with regard to the enforcement. I'm switching gears a little to you, Natalie, to talk more from a legal perspective. And would like to know what practical steps do you think courts, law enforcement, elected officials, and legal advocates can take to strengthen firearm relinquishment enforcement and protect survivors?
Yeah, well, let me give you my very sophisticated legal analysis, which is that people just need to talk to each other. Right. And I think it may be helpful to sort of like spell out exactly what that means, right? Because we've talked about high risk teams and we've talked about coordinated community response. Like all of that is so important because we know from years of doing work in the domestic violence space that it does take a team, an interdisciplinary team to support survivors in the way that they need in a holistic and ultimately helpful way that is going to keep them safe, right? So it is the same philosophy brought to this issue. So imagine a situation where the police are called to a home, right? And it is a responding officer who shows up. That officer needs to document the fact that potentially there was a firearm used in the incident, or that they see a firearm lying around on the living room table when they came, right? Unless they know to write that down, when the detective is assigned to the case, they're not going to know to ask about guns, right? So the officer needs to communicate with the detective. The detective needs to be writing this stuff down, right? Putting it in the report, putting it in whatever documents that they are then turning over to the prosecutor, right? So that the prosecutor can make the appropriate charges, right? So that way, when there's a trial and the defendant gets on the stand under oath and says, no, I don't have a firearm, right? Because we actually don't have an independent way of verifying that in the state. Hopefully we'll get to that later. The prosecutor can say, wait, hold on, I have a couple of follow-up questions here, right? According to my report, according to all of these, right? So, but they can't do that unless they have the information, right? And unless the judge then has that information, right? Walking this further down the line, the judge can't enter an order saying, defendant, you have to surrender this firearm, right? The judge can't implement all of these best practices that Erin was talking about, right? Like following up on relinquishment, right? Saying I've got to see you back in my courtroom in 48 hours with some kind of proof that you have surrendered this firearm per my order, right? You need that order, and the judge can't issue the order unless they have the information they need further down the line, right? And then just to finish to finish the thought here, right? That information even needs to get to probation, right? So they're able to see, hey, this person is not allowed to have a firearm, right? So that when this is a true story, I learned this at a conference on crimes against women once, when there was this amazing probation officer who happened to be looking through this person's, I don't know what it was at that time, Facebook or TikTok, and there they were, photos of them at the gun range holding a gun. You're not allowed to be doing that, right? So everybody in this process needs to have information and needs to be able to support everybody else to achieve this common goal of getting these firearms out of the hands of people who under the law are not permitted to have them, right? The law is not the hard part here. The law very clearly says if you have a domestic violence felony, misdemeanor, or you're under domestic violence protective order, you cannot have a gun. Federal law, Texas law, right? So it's a matter of figuring out how are we going to do that when at this point, the best we have is the honor system, and I think we can do better. The last thing I'll say, and because I think we'll get to this later, is I think doing that requires funding. It requires initiative. I mean, you talked about the 10-ish, let's say, jurisdictions in Texas that have these protocols. You know, the reason that number fluctuates too is that oftentimes these are like single-handedly spearheaded by one really committed, really dedicated judge or prosecutor or DA, but those protocols aren't institutionalized, they aren't memorialized, so that when that judge leaves the bench or when we get a new DA, just we're starting from scratch. And so I think a super important part, I think Erin is 100% right, that these are really hyper local decisions. We don't need to wait for the state to tell us what to do in a particular county, but like when somebody's taking the initiative, it's so important to somehow get that codified, because what we've seen unfortunately over and over in the state is that there are all these like just really creative and like effective solutions that are working, and then like the one person who's spearheading it for whatever reason is no longer there, and then things fall apart.
You've honestly, like, what you've answered is in part very similar to what I was gonna ask next. And I think this can be open to any of you. Natalie, you might have additional thoughts on this, or Erin or Jeremy, but we've been talking a lot about how relinquishing, Texas law requires abusers to relinquish firearms, but the enforcement is inconsistent. That's a problem we've made very clear. So just digging in a little bit more, how do legal where are those legal enforcement gaps and policy challenges, and how do they affect survivor safety? And what strategies or legislative processes could improve compliance? And you've already answered some of that. You said, like, we need documentation, we need to codify, like we need coordinated teams. Is there anything else that we're missing here that you all think needs to happen to get 10 plus many more counties putting a protocol into place that makes this safer for survivors?
I think it's important just to highlight kind of what Natalie and I were both saying earlier about like it is the local issue. So you can start addressing these in your area. You don't necessarily have to wait for some big organization to come in. And I think maybe some counties are not aware of that, or they see it as like this big, you have to overhaul everything, whereas you can take those smaller steps towards bridging some of those gaps. So working on incorporating the affidavit of relinquishment, working on providing storage, some of those things that I mentioned earlier, um, working on coordinating with different community partners on cases instead of staying in a specific silo and only working in your area and providing that communication on these cases, especially when we know that there are higher lethality factors present, not just firearms, but strangulation, stalking, any of those factors is imperative for survivors' safety and well-being. These protocols allow prohibited possessors to safely relinquish those firearms for the time they're prohibited before violence continues to occur in the future. Yeah, on another note too, I don't think I touched on this earlier, but this legislative session, TCFU worked alongside lawmakers to pass Senate Bill 1946, which established a family violence criminal homicide prevention task force. And I just want to highlight it because the task force will look at those top lethality factors, including firearms, to discuss legislation moving forward, determine next steps for lowering the number of family violence homicides in the state of Texas, and bring people from across the state to the same table to figure out what are the underlying issues, where are the gaps, what are the next steps we need to take to continue working on this.
Excellent. It's so great to hear that you made that progress. I think Swati's here on the number that just came in. And so Swati, I'm gonna spend lots of time with you in just a second. I'm so glad you made it and sorry for the challenges. We're Jeremy and Natalie, and Erin, we're just kind of answering some thoughts on how gaps in relinquishment protocols of firearms are affecting survivors and the solutions they think we need to put forward. So I'm going to give them a chance to finish that question and then we'll go to you.
I just want to, amplify and reiterate what both Erin and Natalie said. I mean, it comes down to getting out of our silos and having the conversations. We see that a lot in my area, in particular, in rural areas, and in funding, right? If the funding goes away, then we lose that person. So just having those conversations, building those relationships, and it can be community volunteers, community members. We're looking down the road to build a faith-based coalition in our community. So just getting the whole community involved surrounding the issue, right, can create the safety that's needed for survivors and kind of build a foundation so that if the person spearheading it, like they were saying, if a judge doesn't get reelected or whatever the reason may be, that there's a contingency plan in place, that it continues moving forward. And so I think it's really crucial, the points that they made, in particular, not waiting on legislation to pass for us to do the work in the field now, right? And, make those connections, establish whatever it be, the domestic violence high risk team, the firearm transfer protocol, because there, I have hope that there are people in every community that want to support this because they see it as a need.
Yeah, well, and let me just chime in to continue to build on this lovely consensus that's developing here. There was a bill, Erin, I'm sure you can correct me if I'm wrong, in 23, so not this session, but the one before, that would have required every county to establish a task force, right? To talk about these issues, recognizing, look, the problems that are and the way that this issue is manifesting in urban areas looks really different than suburban areas and rural areas, right? So counties should be able to develop protocols that make sense for them. It didn't pass, but again, that doesn't mean that people can't still go and do that on their own initiative, right? And to the extent that this seems overwhelming, if there's anybody on this call, there are so many best practices that are out there, right? You don't have to start from scratch. I mean, I know I've written about this. I know TCFV has written about this. I'm guessing Texas Gun Sense has materials, right? Like they're everywhere. Just thinking about like, so you want to start a program, here's the things that you need to be thinking about. I think, again, to Jeremy's point, funding is absolutely critical, right? I mean, to the extent that I think coordination is really important, having somebody to serve that coordinating function can be make or break, right? Just somebody who's rallying everybody, funding for physical infrastructure, like where are you going to store surrendered weapons? You're just going to like keep them on the hallway, right? So that kind of stuff. And then the training for police, for prosecutors, for judges, for community members on how to successfully implement is really important. And just because I don't want to lose sight of this, just one other really, really big thing, right? Where I think we started talking about how, we just have a lot of guns in this country, in this state, and I don't want to lose sight of how comprehensive reform will ultimately make survivors of intimate partner violence safer, right? So I know, Nicole, y'all have done so much work on safe storage, on red flag laws, on comprehensive background checks, on even if I may dare to dream registration, right? Like all of these things, all of everything that we talk about when we talk about kind of common sense, gun reform, those things will make the lives of survivors safer as well, right? So to the extent that we've been talking so far about collaboration among people who work in the space of supporting survivors of intimate partner violence, like I love that we're all on this call together, right? Because all of the things that we do to make sure that guns are in safe hands and are treated responsibly are also going to benefit survivors.
I'm really glad you said that. The comprehensive approach is obviously where we fully agree, and that's the approach that we take. Thank you. Swati, you made it, and you're on the phone, and I'm so sorry for the challenges, but I want to introduce you to everybody. Swati Narayan is the director of AAPI Community Safety at Daya, Houston, and a great partner. And Swati, what we asked everybody when they first came on, and I'm going to ask you, is what are the key challenges in addressing domestic violence in Texas communities today? And how do firearms play a role in the risks survivors face, in your view?
Well, first of all, I am so sorry that I am not visibly there. I'm audibly here, and I blow dried my hair, and I'm not on a screen. No, but I apologize. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I am sure that I'm probably repeating what the other panelists said, but in terms of, well, so to sort of take a step back, and let me talk about Daya just a little bit, where I work, because we formed, our genesis was to be able to address issues of domestic violence in a culturally specific way. So we work primarily with the South Asian community, recognizing that there are multiple languages, religions, the culture. I mean, there's so many different nuances that are present just within that sort of diaspora. And so our doors are open to everyone, but that has sort of been our expertise around the issues of domestic violence. So when you talk about how it affects our communities, we see it. I will say that we had just this, so our stats just from January until September, we saw among our clients around 16% of our clients indicated that there was the threat of a firearm. And we also see that the types of abuse that they experience are heightened when there is the presence of a firearm, meaning there's there's different types of violence or abuse that can be present in domestic abuse. There's, religious abuse, there's emotional, there's physical, there's financial, and that may have already been talked about. But we see all of those heightened almost to 100%, especially when it comes to emotional abuse, when there is a presence of a firearm. The challenges that our communities face. So there's already some language barriers, right? And then for us, when we're able to sort of disaggregate that data, we are able to then target our prevention efforts, maybe in different languages, or talking to specific members of those communities. We know that when many Afghanis came over here as refugees, many of them came from villages. They were helping our troops and, whatever during the war. They came over from villages. Many of the men didn't have a formal education. So when they come over here and they're looking for employment, one of the first jobs that they know or they're able to do with some degree of confidence is to become security guards. So when they become security guards, they're often given a firearm. They come home, that firearm is just left on, on the kitchen table, or what, it's not stored securely. That presents a danger. If you've got a family that is experiencing abuse of some sort, whether it's intimate partner violence or domestic abuse, that the presence of that firearm can exacerbate the situation, as you all have probably talked about. So hopefully that sort of addresses the nuances of how the presence of a firearm affects different communities, and specifically like the South Asian community.
No, Swati, everything you're sharing is really interesting and adding depth to the conversation. It's really fascinating what you said about the security guard issue. That's really interesting. You touched on this a little bit already, but the next question we had for you is in your work with supporting AAPI survivors, how does building cultural trust and understanding shape effective safety planning, and what lessons can other advocates take from that approach, do you think?
I mean, building cultural trust starts with honoring survivors' identities, right? Like the language, family dynamics, immigration status, faith traditions. They need to feel seen when they're seeking safety. Otherwise, it's just all foreign to them. And then safety planning becomes effective when it aligns with cultural realities, right? When you can have somebody who can talk about, we understand, you're living with extended families. We understand what a mother-in-law may think or a father-in-law may think, or what the pressures are within those family dynamics. And then building trust through cultural touch points, right? That's another key part. People will come. We just celebrated Diwali, which was our New Year's. It was on Monday, and which so many people within South Asia celebrate. There were multiple festivals throughout. I'm in Houston, so there were multiple festivals throughout Houston. We made sure that we were present at those festivals, even if somebody doesn't come and talk to us, that we're rooted in our community, that that's where that buy-in comes from, and that they can see us and that we are there. And that sort of opens the doors for conversations around safety that, sometimes would otherwise be stigmatized. Again, I spoke about the language, right? Like our team, our staff speaks over 16 different languages. That helps so much when you've got clients, survivors who come and when they call us and they process in a language or where English is not their dominant language, being able to talk in and process in a language that is sort of part of who they've been, since they were born, really helps to, allay them and communicate exactly, what they're experiencing and what's going on. also really important to recognize the complexities of like immigration and dependency, community pressures, economic barriers. That all helps advocates create realistic and safe options for our survivors. That intersectional understanding of religion, generational expectations, gender. They all identify the nuanced patterns of power and control that may be unique to AAPI communities. And then when I say like AAPI communities, that is because that's the realm and the umbrella under which we have been working. But the same could be said about other Asian communities, or the same could be said about, Native American communities, right? Like each community has their own specific, cultural nuances, and to be able to identify them and talk within the context of those is very allaying, and helps build trust. Those community partnerships with faith leaders, mediators, other ethnic associations, they also help extend safety networks beyond just like crisis lines, and they help cultivate that sense of belonging. And I think it's important to understand that cultural competence is about knowledge, right? It's about understanding languages and the traditions and systems of belief. But cultural humility, which is also something we embody, is about stance. It's about approaching every survivor as the expert in their own context, even though we may share the same cultural background, and therefore it recognizes the power dynamics and helps us apply our expertise with openness and empathy. And I think that that's something that other advocates could take away, just sort of from our experiences. I hope that sort of answers your question.
No, that's great. No, you've
rambling a little bit.
You're not. It's great. Thank you, Swati. I think what I'm going to do is we had a couple questions as we get closer to 1 o'clock. We have a couple questions that were meant for all of you. So I'm going to move to those. Erin, I'm going to go back to you, and then we can just kind of go around the room. What are practical actions attendees who are watching can take? We have a nice group, individually or in their communities, to support survivors and reduce firearm-related domestic violence risks.
Yeah, so you can reach out to your local community representatives to discuss how they're implementing firearm transfer protocols, if they're implementing those at all, and ask how you can have a role in making sure those are implemented as time goes on. You can also reach out to your local domestic violence agency to see if there's anything you can do to volunteer with them. I most recently came from a domestic violence agency. That's where I was working, and many of the times centers have volunteer programs that range anything from administrative work to volunteering as an advocate. So there's usually something for everyone if you have time and the resources to volunteer. If you're someone that is already working with survivors, don't be afraid to ask about safety. Ask them about how they're feeling about their safety. Ask them about the presence of a firearm. Those are important questions that you shouldn't be afraid to ask as you're working with survivors. Additionally, if you want to stay up to date with the work we're doing at TCFB around policy, including policy related to firearms, you can join our Capital Crew, which I have the link to, but I'm not sure I have a way to post it anywhere.
We can send it in our follow-up along with
Yeah.
the Honoring Texas Victims report, which we were planning on doing. So just send that to us.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, you can check that out as well to stay up to date on things that are happening, policy related, specifically for family violence. Yeah, and just get involved in your local community is a good first step.
Perfect. Jeremy, what practical actions do you think attendees could take to reduce firearm-related domestic violence risks?
Yeah, I connect with your local domestic violence agency. Like Erin was saying, we're always in need of volunteers, but also, talk to your local officials. Find out if there's a domestic violence high risk team, in your community. If not, someone alluded to earlier, like there's models out there, there's information out there, and reach out to us at TCFV. We can provide the information for the model for you to build it to fit your community needs. And contact your legislators to let them know um, the issue in your community. Let them know it's important to you. Let them know what bills you think support survivor safety. And just be willing to have the conversation. I mean, it kind of sounds basic. October's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but awareness and education are the first steps to change. So I think it starts there.
Perfect. Natalie?
So I had a feeling that I would have all the same ideas as my co-panelists, so I'm glad I prepared a backup. Okay, so a tiny preface, which is that my last research project actually involved speaking to men who had been sentenced to attend the better intervention programs that Jeremy mentioned earlier, right? Because they had domestic violence convictions. And because, as I suggested earlier, we operate largely on an honor system, I was really interested in hearing directly from them about whether they knew that they were prohibited possessors. And spoiler alert, they all did, right? And so then, like, what was it that was preventing them, in theory, from complying with the law, right? So I do not have the 10 hours it would take to explain all of my findings. I want to just highlight one, right, which is really consistent with a lot of the other research on this issue, which is what we heard over and over and over. And what people who ask questions like this hear over and over and over and over is that they would rather be caught with a gun than without it, right? And really what that means is, again, back to what I was saying before about just like we are awash in guns, which ultimately is making our communities less safe, not more safe. And so if we can make our communities, more broadly speaking, safer, right? I do believe that people will be more likely to comply with the laws that are on our books, right? So I'm back to thinking really holistically about this problem, right? So maybe there's somebody on here who's like, oh, wow, domestic violence is not my space. It seems a bit intimidating or overwhelming to try to like walk into a shelter. Like, that's fine. I mean, like, please do all the things that Erin and Jeremy said, because those were like my first answers too. But like, if there are other things that you could do to make your communities safe, and that is everything from like thinking about parks and thinking about public education and thinking about public safety, right? Like that means that people will not feel the need to have guns, right? Because they again, they would rather be caught with them than without them. And so I think that the general public safety, public support, making our communities places that are not war zones is going to help this problem as well. And there's something we can all do to achieve that big, I'll admit it, that big goal.
Natalie, that is, thank you for sharing that. That is very interesting and really making my my mind go to a lot of places. Swati, I wanted to give you the chance to ask about practical actions attendees can take.
Well, I think I I echo the same thing that everybody has said. Like all of my esteemed panelists are 100% correct. I think at the very core, the first thing that we can all do is believe survivors when they tell us what has happened or what they're experiencing, and not to judge them or not to ask like, well, why didn't they leave before? The prior panelist was just, and I am so sorry, Laura was it Lori, the person who just spoke before me when she was
Natalie.
talking about Natalie, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Like creating spaces where people don't feel like they need to be on guard at all times. I mean, it is the infrastructure, it is the culture that currently exists that perpetuates people's desire, need to buy firearms, right, or to have a firearm. And if that infrastructure can be changed, if mindsets can be shifted, if we can create safety for everyone, then I firmly believe there will be fewer firearms. There won't be a need for it. But at the very heart, just like always centering the survivor, always centering the person who has been harmed. And then, like everyone else was saying, partnering with law enforcement, faith advocates, normalizing these conversations about safety, and not having them in isolated spaces where it almost sounds taboo. And then, of course, also supporting and joining advocacy groups like Texas Gun Sense. I mean, these are all things that we can do. People talk about, being a single issue voter. We can embrace all of the aspects around domestic violence and harm, and make a commitment to change whatever we can in the spaces that we occupy so that people around us feel safer.
Thank you so much, Swati. And I'm actually going to go backwards and kind of like have you, I'm going to give everybody a chance to just, if you could answer this in like a brief 1 minute, but Swati, go ahead and continue talking. And here's a question. What gives you hope for survivors and communities in Texas?
The survivors themselves, like their courage to rebuild their lives in a system that wasn't designed for them, and their determination to find safety and dignity, and their insistence on being heard. I mean, every time a survivor calls the helpline, that is what they are expressing. And also what gives me hope is like the growing collaboration across our communities, whether it's advocates, judges, officers, faith leaders. Everyone's finally, or more people are finally begin to sit at the table and ask, like, what more can we do? And like programs like ours, like at Daya, underscore that coordinated care rooted in trust and culture can save lives and transform communities. I think it's so important to recognize that survivors shouldn't be defined by what happened to them, but rather they themselves are sort of defining what's possible for all of us. There are so many survivors who have, in their journey, have gone from reaching out, asking for support, to leading organizations themselves, leading nonprofits, guiding policy conversations. And these are places where their voices were once excluded. So like, those are the things that give me hope.
Super inspiring. Natalie?
I mean, I'm inspired by the number of people that are sitting here with us on this webinar today who care enough about this to join us and engage in this conversation with us. I mean, the other thing is that I really do firmly believe that on this issue, and honestly, on probably more than we think, like there's more agreement than disagreement on some of these core issues, right? Like I think you say you're working on guns in Texas, and people automatically assume that it's a lost cause. And I think when it comes to honestly many issues, and today we're focused on the intersection of guns and intimate partner violence, that we can all agree. And again, when they survey this, they find that like gun owners, people who are strong support of the Second Amendment, also think that if you've demonstrated that you can't use a gun responsibly, then your access to it should be curtailed. So again, I think there's more that unites us than divides us in a lot of ways.
We find that to be true with all of our conversations, gun owners, people from across the political spectrum. Yes. Jeremy, what gives you hope?
This conversation and, being able to travel across the state and meet many other professionals engaged in the work and also engaged in these conversations, to see that it's becoming more normalized to talk about the intersection of domestic violence and firearms, how to build an intentional and effective coordinated community response, and what that looks like for everyone's community. And really just to kind of piggyback off what Swati said, the resilience of survivors, and letting them lead our work to guide true change. So,
thank you. Yes, Erin.
I think my co-panelists covered a lot of what I was thinking as well. But yeah, I'll just echo some of what they said, particularly about survivors. Survivors are the experts in their own experiences, and they are so incredibly resilient. So I feel really privileged in my capacity to work in the field of family violence advocacy. It's a privilege to work alongside those survivors, advocates, community partners to amplify their voices and implement change. It gives me hope to see some of the great work that is already being done in our communities, even though there's still a long road ahead. With advocates working hard to meet survivor needs, community partners coming together, such as in those domestic violence high-risk teams, and working with legislatures to pass laws that ultimately improve survivor safety and well-being in the future. Seeing those changes happen in real time, both in the legal field and in the conversations that are occurring around family violence, is rewarding and provides so much hope as I continue my work and as we continue our work at TCFV. One thing that I want attendees to take away from today's conversation is that firearm-related family violence homicides truly are preventable, and that every single person can play a role in helping decrease the number of family violence homicides that we see across the state.
Excellent. Any other last quick reflections that we missed from you all? Thank you guys so much. This was such a great conversation. I loved everything you all said, and to be able to work with you on this really important issue. And like one of my takeaways and that I'm always thinking about, and today included, is that our work is incremental and long term, and that makes it hard, but that also makes it possible because we can bite off chunks and pieces and continue to do that work. And I think that is what we are all doing as it relates to domestic violence and firearms and firearm violence in general. So thank you so much. I coordinated with one person who put a question in the chat that we just didn't have time to get to, but we will follow up with you. And then we will send all of you who are listening TCFV's excellent Honoring Texas Victims report. And there was something else we were going to send out. Erin, you had another resource, I think. And just want to encourage everyone who's here to stay active, continue to raise your voices and awareness, support survivors, and stay tuned for some information we're going to be pushing out as the holidays approach. It's always important to remember the critical need for secure storage and those conversations, which is just connected to everything that we've been talking about. And it's really important during the holidays, especially when children are home or people might be in crisis, which of course is something we think about all year long too. Thank you all again for joining. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks for your patience, Swati, with the tech challenges. And I'm so glad you made it. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.